I was searching the National Archives for Cold War naval deployments when I found Admiral Richard E. Byrd's Operation High Jump logs. 13 ships, 4,700 men, 33 aircraft deployed to Antarctica in December 1946, the largest polar expedition in American history. The mission was scheduled for 6 to 8 months. It returned in April 1947 after barely 2. Then, in the 1990s, a diary surfaced claiming Byrd had flown over the pole and discovered an ancient city beneath the ice. The diary's never been authenticated. Byrd's family denies it. He died in 1957. By 1959, Antarctica was locked under international treaty. The question isn't whether aliens exist under the ice. It's whether something extraordinary happened or whether military secrecy created the perfect legend. I started pulling Operation High Jump documents because I wanted to understand why the Navy deployed so many resources to Antarctica immediately after World War II. What I found was an expedition that made every previous polar mission look modest by comparison. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, 4,700 personnel. Operation High Jump launched from Norfolk, Virginia on December 2, 1946. The official designation was Task Force 68, subdivided into 3 operational groups. The Central Group, commanded by Admiral Richard E. Byrd himself, would establish the main base at Little America 4 on the Ross Ice Shelf. The Western Group would map the coastline west of the Ross Sea. The Eastern Group would survey the area between the Weddell Sea and the Indian Ocean, not a small expedition testing one hypothesis, not a handful of scientists with limited support, the largest concentration of military hardware ever deployed to the poles by any nation. The official mission statement, released to newspapers in November 1946, outlined 4 objectives. Test military equipment under extreme polar conditions. Establish the framework for permanent American bases in Antarctica. Train naval personnel in cold weather operations. Conduct extensive aerial photography to map previously unexplored regions, all reasonable, all consistent with post-war American interest in strategic polar positioning. Nothing in the public briefings suggested anything beyond standard military preparation. Here's what matters about who led this operation. Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd was 58 years old when High Jump departed. By 1946, he was the most famous explorer in America. His credentials were beyond question. In 1926, he claimed the first flight over the North Pole, piloting a Fokker trimotor with Floyd Bennett. The claim faced some dispute over navigation accuracy, but Congress awarded him the Medal of Honor regardless. In 1929, he made an indisputable flight over the South Pole, the first confirmed aerial crossing. Between 1928 and 1941, he led 3 major Antarctic expeditions. He established Little America Base. He spent 5 months alone at an advanced weather station in 1934, nearly dying from carbon monoxide poisoning before rescue. He published best-selling books. He received ticker tape parades. When Byrd spoke about Antarctica, the nation listened. This wasn't a fringe figure leading a questionable mission. This was America's most decorated polar explorer, commanding the most resource-intensive Antarctic operation ever attempted. The Navy assigned the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea, the submarine USS Senate, the destroyer USS Brownson, the icebreaker USS Burton Island, and multiple supply ships, seaplane tenders, and cargo vessels. Aircraft included 6 R-4D transport planes modified for ice landings, 6 Martin PBM Mariner flying boats for reconnaissance, and helicopters for short-range operations. The Mariners could fly patterns covering thousands of square miles, equipped with the most advanced aerial cameras available in 1946. The expedition planned to photograph approximately 60% of Antarctica's coastline, vast stretches never documented from the air. Budget estimates vary by source, but the operation cost between $3 and $15 million. Significant expenditure for 1946. Personnel included geologists, meteorologists, photographers, and ice specialists alongside sailors and pilots. The expedition carried construction equipment for semi-permanent structures and supplies to sustain operations for 6 to 8 months. Some preparations suggested readiness for a year-long deployment if conditions permitted. The mission departed with considerable press attention. Byrd described the scientific importance of Antarctica and America's need to establish presence on the continent. Nobody suggested anything unusual was expected. The mission was scheduled to return in late spring or early summer of 1947. Operation High Jump returned to the United States in April 1947, not 6 months into the mission, not 8 months, 2 months after arrival in Antarctica. Consider the math. The expedition reached Antarctic waters in late December 1946 and early January 1947, the peak of Antarctic summer. The ships departed in late February and arrived stateside in April. That places the termination decision in late January or early February, barely 4 to 6 weeks into deployment. For an expedition planned for 6 months minimum, budgeted for millions, involving nearly 5,000 personnel, a month of operations seemed insufficient to justify the commitment. The official explanation was straightforward. Early onset of Antarctic winter made continued operations unsafe. Weather conditions deteriorated faster than anticipated. Ice formations threatened ship movements. The prudent decision was to withdraw while navigation remained possible rather than risk vessels becoming trapped. Reasonable, logical, consistent with known Antarctic weather patterns. Except the timing didn't quite match the pattern. Byrd gave few detailed public statements after returning. In March 1947, he was summoned to Washington for classified briefings at the Pentagon. The specific content of those briefings has never been fully declassified. Official records indicate Byrd discussed operational challenges, equipment performance, and strategic considerations for future Antarctic presence. This was March 1947. The National Security Act, which created the CIA and reorganized American military intelligence, was signed into law that July. The institutional Cold War apparatus was being constructed in real time. Press coverage of High Jump's return was minimal compared to the departure. Byrd participated in a few radio interviews, describing the ice, the difficulty of the work, the importance of continued Antarctic research. His tone was measured, professional. He didn't suggest anything extraordinary had occurred. But here's what stood out in contemporary accounts. Associates noted that Byrd seemed less enthusiastic about discussing High Jump compared to his previous expeditions, which he had publicized extensively through books, lectures, and media tours. After his 1929 South Pole flight, he toured constantly. After his 1934 solo winter, he published detailed memoirs. Byrd was not a man who typically understated his experiences. His relative silence after High Jump suggested something had changed. Within Navy circles, personnel who served on High Jump began sharing accounts that didn't appear in official reports. Mentions of unusual radar behavior in certain regions, compass difficulties beyond normal magnetic pole interference, areas where radio communication inexplicably failed. Veterans described sections of coastline generating localized weather anomalies, pockets of warmer air where none should exist. None of these accounts appeared in the declassified mission logs. By 1948, Operation High Jump had faded from public discourse, but the questions about its abbreviated timeline never received detailed answers beyond the official weather explanation. The silence lasted decades, then something surfaced that made the early return impossible to ignore. In the early 1990s, references began appearing to a document circulating in UFO research communities. It was presented as Admiral Byrd's personal diary, specifically entries from February 1947 during Operation High Jump. The diary described an extraordinary flight over the North Pole, not the Antarctic where High Jump was deployed, the North Pole thousands of miles away. The geographic contradiction was immediate and glaring, but the level of detail was specific, almost technical. The diary described Byrd piloting a reconnaissance aircraft over Arctic ice when instruments began malfunctioning, magnetic compass spinning, radio cutting to static. The crew noticed changes in the terrain below, not endless white ice, green, vegetation, a shift that violated everything known about polar geography. The diary claimed they flew over a valley where no valley should exist, a region of temperate climate surrounded by glacial ice, with lakes of liquid water and forests growing in conditions that should have been frozen solid. The crew observed structures below, not modern construction, architectural forms suggesting great age, weathered stone arrangements resembling ancient cities built on a massive scale, columns rising hundreds of feet, domes rivaling cathedrals, plazas that could accommodate thousands, all situated in a hidden valley beneath the Arctic ice shelf, visible only from altitude. Then the diary described contact. Disc-shaped craft approached the aircraft, smooth, metallic, demonstrating flight characteristics beyond known technology, instantaneous acceleration, right-angle turns at speeds that should have torn any conventional aircraft apart. The diary claimed Byrd's controls became unresponsive. External control. The craft guided his plane to a landing area within the valley. Byrd and his radio operator were escorted by tall humanoid beings into underground chambers, where they met with entities the diary called the Masters. These beings communicated telepathically, warning about humanity's atomic weapons and expressing concern about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The surface world was being monitored to prevent nuclear catastrophe. The Masters sent Byrd back with a message for world governments. Afterward, the disc craft escorted the plane back beyond the ice shelf boundary, and controls returned to normal. Consider what's missing from this account. Any verifiable original document. No manuscript has ever been produced for independent examination. The diary exists only in typed transcription, never as handwritten original in Byrd's documented penmanship. Byrd's family denied any knowledge of such a diary. They stated that Byrd's actual journals and papers, donated to Ohio State University's Byrd Polar Research Center, contain no such entries. Here's where the timeline contradictions become impossible to ignore. Operation High Jump deployed to Antarctica, the South Pole region, the Ross Ice Shelf. Byrd commanded a multi-ship task force stationed thousands of miles from the Arctic. For him to have piloted a flight over the North Pole in February 1947 would have required abandoning his command, travelling to the opposite end of the planet and returning without any record of absence. Navy logs from High Jump account for Byrd's location throughout the operational period. No gap exists where such a flight could have occurred, not a small inconsistency, a fundamental geographic impossibility. The writing style raised additional questions. Byrd's verified journals are methodical, technical, focused on weather observations and operational logistics. The Forbidden Diary reads dramatically, with emotional language and philosophical reflections that don't match the tone of his authenticated works. Linguistic analysis suggested someone familiar with Byrd's story wrote the diary, but not necessarily Byrd himself. Yet the document's circulation persisted precisely because it filled a vacuum. Operation High Jump ended early. Byrd underwent classified debriefing. Years later, a diary emerged explaining why. The lack of authentication couldn't erase the fact that people wanted answers for High Jump's abbreviated timeline. The diary provided them. Scattered veteran testimonies added ambiguous layers to the silence. Accounts emerged in the 1970s and 1980s from personnel who served on High Jump. Nothing about landing in valleys or meeting masters, but descriptions suggesting something unusual. A radar operator mentioned tracking objects at speeds exceeding known aircraft capabilities, attributed to equipment malfunction. A pilot reported compass irregularities. A photographer described lights over the ice he couldn't immediately identify. None confirmed the diary. All were second-hand, reported by family members decades after the alleged events. Here's what the official record actually contains. Declassified Operation High Jump mission reports describe routine operations, weather observations, ice measurements, equipment performance tests, aerial photography cataloguing thousands of square miles of unmapped coastline. Comprehensive and boring. If anything extraordinary occurred, it left no trace in the official record accessible to researchers. The gap between mundane official logs and classified Pentagon briefings became the space where speculation flourished. The diaries spread through alternative research networks in the 1990s coincided with cultural moments primed for such narratives. Declassified Cold War programs were making headlines. Area 51 stories dominated UFO discourse. The X-Files premiered in 1993, making government conspiracy about alien contact mainstream entertainment. The diary appeared when audiences were primed to believe that major military expeditions had encountered something extraordinary that authorities suppressed. Byrd returned to Antarctica one final time in 1956, Operation Deep Freeze. He was 68 years old, serving in a largely ceremonial role. By early 1957, his health was failing. He returned home to Boston. On March 11, 1957, Richard Evelyn Byrd died. Official cause: heart failure. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. The obituaries made no mention of forbidden diaries or hidden civilizations. The deathbed confession emerged years later, not in 1957. According to claims circulating in UFO research communities during the 1970s and 1980s, Byrd made a final statement warning that Antarctica contained secrets that would shock humanity. That lands existed beyond the poles. That forces dwelled there which governments had chosen to conceal. No verified transcript exists. No attending physician went on record. No family member confirmed it. Contemporary newspaper obituaries from March 1957 contain no such warnings. Always second-hand, never verifiable. 2 years and 8 months after Byrd died, 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty. December 1st, 1959. The treaty established Antarctica as a scientific preserve, demilitarized the continent, banned all military activities except in support of research, prohibited nuclear testing, radioactive waste disposal, military maneuvers, guaranteed freedom of scientific investigation, and established inspection protocols, allowing any signatory to verify compliance. Here's what I keep coming back to. The timeline compressed into 13 years. The 1946 deployment of the largest Antarctic expedition in history, the 1947 early return with minimal explanation and classified briefings, the 1947 alleged diary describing impossible encounters that can't be authenticated, the 1956 return for Byrd's final expedition as permanent bases were established, the 1957 death of the one man whose word might have clarified what Operation High Jump actually encountered, the 1959 treaty locking the continent under international control. Not coincidence, sequence, but consider the alternative explanation. Antarctica in 1946 was the last unmapped frontier at the exact moment the United States and Soviet Union were beginning Cold War competition. Polar regions had strategic importance. Nuclear submarines could operate under ice. Early warning radar needed polar coverage. The continent's isolation made it ideal for classified projects requiring zero civilian oversight. Operation High Jump likely ended early because objectives were achieved faster than expected, or winter onset genuinely threatened ship safety. The classified briefings Byrd attended likely concerned practical questions about whether permanent bases were feasible, what resources they'd require, how quickly they could be established if geopolitical necessity demanded, not alien contact. The diary surfaced 40 years after High Jump in an era when government secrecy about UFOs had become cultural touchstone. Authentication mattered less than narrative. The document provided a story explaining High Jump's mysteries in terms more compelling than logistics and geopolitics. The Antarctic Treaty, rather than lockdown of discovered secrets, represented practical Cold War diplomacy. Both superpowers recognized that militarizing Antarctica would be expensive, strategically marginal, and environmentally devastating, rational policy, and yet the legend persists precisely because it can't be definitively disproven. Antarctica remains remote, inhospitable, largely inaccessible except through official scientific programs. The treaty prevents casual exploration, and the continent's isolation makes it a perfect canvas for projection. Any story about what might be hidden there exists beyond easy verification. Let me propose something. Imagine Byrd in his final months, grandchildren asking about Antarctica. If he'd seen something impossible in 1947, he couldn't have spoken without destroying the reputation he spent decades building. If he'd seen nothing but classified Cold War infrastructure, he still couldn't speak. Either way, silence was the only available option. Not mystery, practicality. Operation High Jump mission reports, ship logs and personnel records are all declassified and available through the National Archives. And what they contain is exactly what you'd expect: weather data, equipment performance, ice measurements, operational challenges. The extraordinary is absent. But absence proves nothing. Absence might mean nothing happened, or that something happened and was classified into records not yet released. Here's what the archives actually tell us. Military operations require secrecy. Cold War programs were classified as standard practice. Antarctica was perfect for testing equipment, establishing strategic presence, conducting research that required isolation. The legend exists because secrecy made Antarctica mysterious, an empty white continent, a famous explorer who died before Cold War tensions thawed, a massive expedition ending early, a treaty locking down the continent before independent verification became possible. All the ingredients for mystery without requiring anything mysterious to have actually occurred. The archives preserve Operation High Jump's official story. Equipment logs, not alien diaries. Routine operations, not impossible encounters. And perhaps that's the answer. Perhaps the real story is perfectly ordinary, waiting in filing cabinets for anyone willing to read weather reports instead of searching for ancient civilizations. Or perhaps the real story is classified in files that won't be declassified for another 50 years. Perhaps Byrd saw something that 13 nations agreed to lock away under treaty. We'll never know what Richard Byrd actually thought in his final moments, but Antarctica remains cold and remote and silent, ready to become whatever story we need it to be.